Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations.
Pope Francis has a rather uncomfortable habit. He protects wicked, truly wicked men. We saw this in the first 5 years or so of his pontificate with his handling of Ted McCarrick, who had been silenced and essentially pushed aside by Benedict XVI. Benedict couldn't, for some reason, bring himself to fully strip then Cardinal Ted McCarrick of his office and his duties and his privileges, and then hand him over to secular authorities to be dealt with appropriately. He couldn't quite bring himself to that, and it's unfortunate. It took Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano writing his now famous testimony in 2018 to get something done about this, leading eventually to Cardinal McCarrick being stripped of his titles and then allowing the secular authorities to do what they were going to do with him. But then the Vatican, of course, wrote their own McCarrick report, which may as well have been called the John Paul II and Archbishop Vigano report, because they then blamed all those problems on Archbishop Vigano and Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. To give you an idea of what we're talking about here, the caliber of people in Rome at this time. But Francis had been protecting him until he had to be shamed publicly not to. And we're seeing this replay now, except for whatever reason, Rome is much more resisting this attempt at shaming. What we're seeing now is with Father Marco Rupnik, a priest who was so wicked that the Jesuits expelled him from their order. And he had incurred automatic excommunication, which Pope Francis lifted and restored him to active duty as a priest. Marco Rupnik, for those who might not be aware, was a particularly nasty priest who imposed his own will, we'll say, physically, with nuns. He had a taste for nuns. He coerced them into engaging in violations of their vows and the 6th and 9th commandment with him in ways that, even if our hosts on this platform let me describe to you what he did, I couldn't bring myself to say them because they're so absolutely vile and evil. But he used mass implements and these kinds of things in his wickedness. He incurred automatic excommunication because after coercing them to commit these sins with him to violate their vows, he then used the sacrament of penance, confession, to absolve them of the sins he coerced them into committing with him. That incurs automatic excommunication. And Pope Francis lifted that for him and put him back into active ministry. And Marco Rupnik, by the way, is an artist. We'll put artist in quotes here, but he is an artist who paints rather weird-looking, vacant-eyed images that are supposed to be holy art, but they're not holy. They're vacant-eyed and lead people feeling generally uncomfortable when they see them, some, myself included, thinking the images are diabolical in nature. And this is kind of where the crux of the problem is, because right now the Vatican is, quote-unquote, investigating Father Rupnik. And they've done so for a year, and they said that they haven't found anything yet, which is really weird, but they say they haven't found anything yet. And Catholics from across the internal church divide have all demanded that his artwork, which adorns the shrine at Fatima, shrine at Lourdes, there are some in St. Peter's Basilica, and in random parishes around the world, including at the headquarters of the Knights of Columbus, they have asked that his artwork be removed. And there's been a great deal of resistance to it, by some claiming that this is just cancel culture. The Vatican News website, which is run at least in part by a very close ally of Father Marco Rupnik, continues to use his artwork on holy days of obligation whenever they have a piece that is appropriate. The Vatican isn't going to move on this, and we know now that they're not going to. We actually have proof. We have proof that Pope Francis is protecting him. So we go to Gloria TV for this headline. More Rupnik art appears in Pope Francis's apartment. Yeah, they've got a photograph of his artwork in Pope Francis's artwork. Francis has at least 2 pieces of Rupnik's artwork in Casa Santa Marta, which is a little weird. A little weird until you realize that Father Rupnik was a Jesuit. And he is not the only Jesuit who is deeply, deeply personally corrupt. The Jesuits are practically the vanguard in the church now for changing the church's teachings on certain sins that cry out to heaven for justice. we associate those sins with James Martin, with Father James Martin, also a Jesuit, perhaps the most famous Jesuit in the world right now after Pope Francis. And this is a track record that he's, at the very least, protecting Jesuits, if not, as some have suggested, not only in full-throated agreement with the priests like Father James Martin, but also actually maybe have some of those inclinations himself. There's now that accusation out there. But he's protecting Father Rupnik, and we now have at least a good reason why. He has his own artwork in his own personal quarters, and this tells me we were never going to see justice on this. Let's turn to the article. Quote, last week, the Argentine public television channel Canal de la Ciudad released a video showing an artwork by Father Marco Rupnik that hangs in Francis's personal apartment in the Vatican Santa Marta residence. It is an image of a sleeping St. Joseph with an angel above him. It hangs on the wall next to a door while Francis met with Anita Fernandez on August 8th. Her grandmother was ended during Argentina's military dictatorship. CatholicNewsAgency.com explains that the image is a detail of a larger mosaic installation in a chapel at a religious house in Croatia. It is at least the second artwork by Father Rupnik to hang in Francis's personal quarters. The other is a mosaic of Mary and the child Jesus that Francis spoke about in a video message he sent to a Marian Congress in Aparecida, Brazil in 2023. The Slovenian Father Rupnik has been credibly accused of engaging in violations of the 6th and 9th commandment with dozens of nuns, and has already been found guilty, absolving one of them of their shared sin and confession. In addition, VaticanNews.va still regularly uses Father Rupnik's art to illustrate articles about Catholic feast days. The most recent case was for the Feast of the Assumption below. End quote. And that is the picture of the image they put for the Feast of the Assumption. Yes, a man guilty of the most vile forms of impurity imaginable. Something that none of us would ever even contemplate. They used his artwork for the Feast of the Assumption. This stuff is hard to wrap your head around until you understand that the rot in Rome goes much deeper than Pope Francis and has been there for decades. The Jesuits have been in key positions in the Roman Curia going back to Vatican II, at least, if not before. And when you begin to understand this, you see these manifestations, this protection of men who should not be protected, the Catholic print media that is supposed to be the official authoritative voice of Rome that we should be able to trust in all things, whether it's Vatican News or La Civiltà Cattolica and these other outlets, all do this stuff. And they refuse to ask hard questions of the people running the Roman Curia on behalf of any pope who's sitting at a time, which is, why don't they do something about the priests like Ted McCarrick? Why did it take the media blowing the lid on a story in 2003 that they knew about, that the public knew about, since at least the 1990s? I'm sure if you're old enough to remember those days, I'm old enough to remember those days in the 1990s, that people knew about the problems with priests like McCarrick. We just didn't understand the depth of it, and how oftentimes with Rome's approval, bishops would quietly move priests around. Now we have a better understanding, because they are being protected. And it makes you wonder, too, how deep does that protection go? After all, the new rules for priests were written in part by Ted McCarrick himself after the fallout of the 2003 Boston problem, which then turned into a cascade of stories like that through that decade in the church around the world. Let me know in the comments. Are you surprised? Are you surprised that Pope Francis has pictures painted by Father Rupnik in his personal quarters? Do you think that gives any insight as to why he's not really doing anything about Father Rupnik? Let me know what you have to say about this in the comments, please. Hey, like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.